The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the narrow alley as the young woman sprinted, her heart pounding in her chest. Sweat ran down her forehead, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she glanced over her shoulder. The flashing lights of a police car flickered in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. She was fast, but the officer chasing her was relentless. "Stop right there," the officer yelled, his voice cutting through the still night air. His footsteps quickened as he closed in on her, his pursuit fueled by a mix of authority and anger. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. She knew the consequences, and they were far worse than anything this officer could imagine. The officer didn't know who she was, and that was his mistake. He didn't know that the girl he was chasing was the daughter of someone with power, someone who could make his life change in an instant. But tonight, that secret remained hidden, and the officer's obsession with catching her grew. As he reached the end of the alley, his hand stretched out, ready to grab her, but she slipped away, just out of his reach. The chase continued, each moment more intense than the last. Fear and adrenaline fueled her every move, but she knew this couldn't go on forever. If only he knew the truth, Layla Johnson had always loved the peace and quiet of her neighborhood park. It was a place where she could clear her mind, away from the noise of the city, a place where she could be herself without fear of judgment. This afternoon was no different. The sky was overcast, but the cool breeze made it a perfect day for a walk. She'd been busy with her studies and had barely found a moment for herself, so today, she decided to take some time to unwind. Little did she know that this seemingly ordinary walk would turn into something far darker. She walked along the familiar winding path, her thoughts drifting between school, friends, and her family. Her father, Captain Marcus Johnson, was the head of the local police precinct, and his reputation as a dedicated officer of the law was known throughout the city. Layla had always felt proud of him, but sometimes she couldn't help but wonder about the pressure he faced, about the things he had to endure simply because of who he was. She often tried to distance herself from the complexities of his job, choosing to focus on her own ambitions. But today, there was something in the air that made her uneasy. As she turned the corner, Layla noticed a figure standing off to the side, near one of the park's benches. A police car was parked nearby, but there was no reason to be alarmed. Police officers patrolled the area from time to time. Still, something about the officer's stance seemed off. He stood rigidly, scanning the park with sharp, calculating eyes. Layla didn't think much of it at first, perhaps he was just doing his job. But as she got closer, she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, sharp and piercing. It was unsettling, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. She had walked past officers countless times before without feeling this strange tension in the air. Layla quickened her pace, hoping to simply pass by without drawing attention to herself. Her father had taught her to be cautious, to stay aware of her surroundings, especially when out alone. But she didn't expect a routine walk to end with her being watched like this. As she neared the officer, she felt his eyes follow her every movement. His gaze didn't soften when she briefly glanced up at him. Instead, his stare remained fixed, intense, unwavering. The air between them felt thick with something she couldn't name, but that was slowly suffocating her. She took a deep breath and tried to keep walking, telling herself it was nothing. Just as she was about to walk past him, the officer suddenly stepped forward, blocking her path. His face was stern, his jaw tight. The smile he had earlier when he had greeted other parkgoers was gone. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Can you stop for a moment?" Layla froze. Something in his tone made her stomach twist with unease. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet she felt like she had been caught in some invisible snare. She could feel the muscles in her legs tense, and her instinct screamed at her to run, to get away from him. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" she asked, trying to sound calm, though she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. Her mind raced as she tried to gauge whether there was any reason for him to stop her. The officer didn't answer immediately. He merely stood there, sizing her up with an expression that was hard to read. There was no warmth in his eyes, only cold scrutiny. It reminded Layla of the subtle glances she had received over the years, the judgment in people's eyes that came with being a young black woman in a world that often didn't take her seriously. After a long pause, the officer finally spoke. "Where are you headed?" His question seemed simple enough, but there was an underlying sharpness to it, as if his words carried weight beyond mere curiosity. "I'm just out for a walk," Layla replied, trying to sound confident, though she was beginning to feel a sense of dread creeping up her spine. "Just taking some time to clear my head." The officer didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her words. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and he looked her up and down. There was something in his gaze, something judging, something suspicious. He looked at her as though he knew more about her than she could possibly imagine. His demeanor shifted from one of neutrality to one of distrust. "You don't look like you belong here," the officer said, his voice dripping with condescension. Layla blinked, caught off guard by the officer's words. She felt her chest tighten, the familiar sting of racism seeping into the air between them. It wasn't the first time she had heard something like this. Hadn't the officer seen her face? Didn't he know who her father was? She thought she could brush it off, but the word stung more than she was prepared for. "I'm sorry," she managed to ask, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't belong here," the officer repeated, his tone firmer now, laced with a quiet but unmistakable hostility. "I don't like seeing people like you around here." Layla's mind raced. People like you. She had heard those words too many times before, but today, they felt different. They felt more real, more dangerous. For a moment, she considered asking why he was speaking to her like that, why, after all these years, after all the changes in the city, she was still seen as an outsider. But she knew it wouldn't help. She knew the officer was already determined to view her with suspicion, regardless of the truth. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath quickening as she realized the officer wasn't just asking questions, he was sizing her up, deciding something about her based on the color of her skin. There was no justification for his actions, no explanation for the suspicion, but his body language told her all she needed to know. She had been marked as someone worthy of his suspicion. The officer's words lingered in the air, thick with disdain. Layla's body stiffened, and her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being judged solely for the color of her skin, for reasons that had nothing to do with her actions. The park, which had always felt like a haven for her, now seemed foreign and hostile. The officer took a step closer, his body language growing more imposing, his presence like a weight pressing down on her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice more demanding than before. "Layla," she answered, her throat tight. "Layla Johnson." There was a flicker of recognition in the officer's eyes when she mentioned her last name, but it was fleeting. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to stare at her, his eyes piercing through her as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. "I know who you are," he finally said, his tone shifting, though still laced with suspicion. "But it doesn't matter. What's a young woman like you doing alone out here?" Layla's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by a young woman like you? He wasn't asking to know her intentions, he was questioning her right to even be here, in this space that, by all rights, belonged to everyone. His implication was clear. She didn't belong in a park like this, a park that had always been considered a safe haven for the city's elite. A place for the privileged to relax, walk, and enjoy, not for people like her. "I'm just out for a walk," she repeated, her voice quivering with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's expression hardened, and his gaze remained fixed on her as though she had just uttered an insult. "You think I'm an idiot?" he sneered, his tone dripping with derision. "You're not fooling anyone. People like you don't just walk around here. You must be up to something." The harsh words struck Layla like a slap. People like you, the phrase felt like a gut punch, the same one she'd heard all her life. She had hoped that things had changed, that people had moved past such narrow, ignorant views, but in this moment, she realized that some things never really change. "Look, I'm not doing anything illegal," Layla said, her voice gaining strength as she tried to maintain her composure. But deep down, she could feel her hands trembling, her body on edge, prepared for what could come next. The officer took a step forward, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with a sense of superiority. His posture was stiff, aggressive. Layla instinctively took a small step back, but he noticed and closed the distance between them. "No need to walk away," he said, the edge in his voice sharpening. "I'm just making sure you're not up to something. You know how it is with people like you, can't be too careful, can we?" The word stung, even more than the ones before. "People like you." Layla wanted to lash out, to scream that she wasn't a criminal, that she wasn't what he thought she was. But she couldn't. She knew better than to make a scene. The officer's hostility was palpable, and she feared what might happen if she provoked him further. Instead, she took another step back, trying to put some space between herself and the officer. "I don't know what you're talking about," Layla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just walking." "That's it." But the officer wasn't having it. He reached for his radio, his movements deliberate. "I'm going to need to check you out," he muttered under his breath. His hand hovered over his belt, where his taser was holstered. Layla's heart dropped to her stomach. She had been in situations before where a simple misunderstanding led to unnecessary escalation, and she had no desire for things to spiral out of control. Her mind raced. What could she do? The park was empty, the path deserted, and there was no one around to hear her if things took a turn for the worse. She wanted to shout for help, but something told her that it wouldn't matter. This officer had already made up his mind. The chase had begun, even if there was no crime to pursue. "Stop right there," he barked, taking a step toward her as Layla instinctively began to turn away. "You're not going anywhere until I say so." Layla's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in place. Fear washed over her, but in the pit of her stomach, there was a spark of something else, defiance. She wasn't just a victim of some random encounter. This officer wasn't just a man trying to enforce the law, he was someone who saw her as less than human, someone who judged her without knowing her story, her background, or her worth. Before Layla could react, the officer took another step forward, blocking her path. The tension between them thickened, and she knew in that moment, with chilling certainty, that she had to make a choice. She could either stand there and let him continue his assumption that she was guilty of something, or she could do something drastic to end this before it got any worse. And before she even knew it, she chose. Layla turned sharply and started to run. Her body moved on instinct, her legs pumping beneath her as she sprinted down the path, away from the officer and into the unknown. Fear surged through her, but it was mixed with something else, the raw, primal need to escape. To get away from the invisible cage that the officer's prejudice had put her in. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as her legs carried her through the park, the sound of the officer's footsteps chasing her, growing louder with each passing second. Her breath came in quick gasps, and every turn she took felt like a desperate attempt to outrun the reality she couldn't escape. The officer had seen her as a target from the moment they crossed paths, and his pursuit was not just about her being in the park, it was about who he assumed she was. The officer's mind was already made up before the chase had even begun. Layla could feel it in the way he questioned her, the way he scrutinized her every move, as if he was waiting for her to make a mistake. And with every step she took, every breath she struggled to control, she could hear his words echoing in her head, "People like you don't belong here." It was a sentence that wasn't just meant to push her away, it was meant to remind her of her place. A place she had never chosen, but one society had decided for her the moment she was born. Racial profiling. The words rang through her mind like a bitter truth she had long been aware of but never quite felt so deeply until now. She wasn't just another person walking through the park, she was a black woman in a predominantly white space, and that made her a threat in the eyes of the officer. It didn't matter that she was the daughter of a well-respected, powerful figure in the community. To him, Layla was just another statistic, just another person of color who, in his eyes, didn't belong. As Layla rounded another corner, she glanced back and saw the officer closing the distance. His eyes were locked on her, his face twisted with frustration, but also with something darker, an entitlement, a belief that his authority gave him the right to chase her down without question. She had never felt more vulnerable. The fear that gripped her wasn't just about being caught, it was about the long history of being targeted simply because of her skin color, a history that had been handed down for generations. This was the weight of being black in a world that often saw her as less, even in spaces she thought were safe. She could hear his voice getting louder, his tone now filled with the urgency of a man who felt threatened by something as simple as her presence. "Stop!" "I said stop," he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence of the park. Layla's legs burned, but she didn't dare slow down. She had no idea what would happen if he caught her. Would he accuse her of something she hadn't done? Would he escalate the situation to violence, like so many times before when people of color were unjustly treated by law enforcement? There was a part of her, deep inside, that wondered if this was the officer's plan all along, to teach her a lesson, to remind her that the world would never see her as equal. No matter who her father was, no matter how successful or respected, none of it would shield her from the prejudice embedded in the very system she lived in. As she ran, Layla could feel her mind racing just as fast as her body. How many times had she been told she needed to work harder, be better, be more than what others expected of her? She had spent her life proving that she belonged, that she was worthy of being treated with dignity and respect, but all it took was one person, one officer, to tear that illusion apart. "You don't belong here." Suddenly, the officer's voice rang out again, louder and more insistent. "I know who you are," he shouted. "You think I'm just going to let you get away with this?" Layla's stomach dropped as she heard the words. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The officer had finally recognized her. But it wasn't her accomplishments or her integrity that he recognized, it was her name, a name that carried weight because of who her father was. She could almost hear the contempt in his voice now, his anger turning to disbelief. To him, it didn't matter who her father was or how much good he had done for the community. To him, she was still the same as every other black person he had ever viewed as a threat. The thought of what might happen next terrified Layla. She had seen the videos. She had heard the stories of people who were treated unfairly, brutally, because they were black. She could feel the weight of that history pressing down on her, her breath becoming shallow as her legs began to give out. Her feet hurt, but she couldn't stop, not yet. Then, just as she felt herself slowing down, the officer's voice cut through the air again. "I don't care who your father is," he screamed. "You think just because he's some big shot, I'm supposed to let you get away with this? You think you're better than me?" That was the moment when the officer's true racism became undeniable. He wasn't just chasing her because of some imagined crime, he was chasing her because of who she was, because of the color of her skin. And that, more than anything else, was what infuriated him. He couldn't stand that someone like her could walk freely in the same space he believed belonged to him and his. Layla's legs were heavy, her breathing labored, but she pushed forward. The officer's words, his assumptions about her, didn't matter anymore. What mattered was surviving this. What mattered was proving that despite everything, the prejudice, the hatred, the systemic barriers, she still had the right to exist, to walk through the world without fear. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how much she pushed herself, Layla couldn't outrun the reality that had followed her all her life. The unrelenting grip of racism that lingered just beneath the surface of every encounter, every interaction. This was her reality, her fight, and she would face it, whether she was ready or not. As Layla's feet pounded against the park's gravel path, the sound of her breath mixing with the rhythm of her footfalls, the oppressive weight of the officer's presence never left her. The chase had officially begun. She could feel his eyes on her, his footsteps echoing just behind, his breath growing heavier as he closed the gap between them. Every step she took felt like a fight against something much larger than herself, an unseen system of prejudice and fear, one that she had long understood but never experienced so directly until now. For a brief moment, Layla's mind wandered, her thoughts desperate and frantic. Why was this happening? What had she done to deserve this kind of treatment? She wasn't running from a crime, she was simply walking in a park, a place she thought would offer a respite from the chaos of the outside world. But here she was, fleeing from a man who had decided she was guilty before she'd even spoken a word. As she glanced over her shoulder, she saw the officer's figure growing larger in the distance. His movements were swift, deliberate, but there was a force to his pursuit that unnerved her. He wasn't just trying to stop her, he was coming after her. His body language screamed aggression, and the power in his stride was unsettling. Every footstep he took was filled with the certainty that she had done something wrong. Something she hadn't done. But to him, it didn't matter. She was a black woman in a predominantly white park, and in his mind, that was enough to justify his actions. "Stop right there," the officer shouted again, his voice a sharp command that cut through the air like a whip. Layla's heart skipped a beat, the sound of his voice fueling her panic. Her mind raced as her body moved on autopilot, pushing her forward despite the heaviness in her legs. She couldn't stop now, not with him so close. She couldn't risk what might happen if he caught her. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind: always be aware of your surroundings, always stay calm, always stay in control. But all of those lessons felt useless now. The officer had already made up his mind, and in that moment, he wasn't seeing her for who she was: a college student, a daughter, a person. He was only seeing the color of her skin and the assumptions that came with it. Layla's chest tightened as she heard his footsteps drawing nearer, the sound growing louder with each passing second. She pushed herself harder, her legs aching with the effort. She was fast, but the officer was relentless, closing in with every stride. Fear clawed at her insides, and the sense of being trapped became suffocating. It was as if the whole park, the wide, open space, had somehow turned into a cage, and no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the reality of being hunted. Another shout rang out from the officer, this time with more urgency. "I said stop." His voice had shifted from a command to something darker, something full of frustration, as if her running was a personal affront to him. It was in that moment that Layla realized just how far this officer's bias had gone. He wasn't just chasing her for running. He was chasing her because he felt entitled to control her, to assert his authority over someone he didn't see as equal. Layla's mind raced. There was nowhere to hide, no escape. The officer's relentless pursuit made it clear that she wasn't going to outrun him forever. There was only one option left: confront him, or risk being cornered and forced to face whatever fate he had in store for her. Just ahead, Layla spotted a row of trees lining the path, their thick trunks offering some cover. It wasn't much, but it was her best chance. She veered toward the trees, hoping to throw the officer off her trail. Her heart raced as she weaved between the thick branches, using the foliage to mask her movements. She could hear the officer crashing through the underbrush behind her, his pursuit unrelenting. Each snap of a twig beneath his boots only pushed her forward, each desperate breath in her chest urging her to keep going. But as she sprinted through the trees, Layla could feel the distance between them shrinking. The officer was closing in, and the fear of being caught by someone who had already made up his mind about her began to suffocate her. What would happen if he caught her? Would he arrest her for simply walking through the park? Would he accuse her of something she hadn't done, something justifiable in his mind because of who she was? The fear was overwhelming, clouding her thoughts, and for a moment, Layla wondered if she had any hope of escaping this man's wrath. As the trees began to thin out and the open space of the park stretched ahead, Layla heard the officer's footsteps slow. He had seen her dart into the trees, and he wasn't far behind, but for a moment, it seemed like he had lost her. Layla took a deep breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to make a choice. She could either keep running and hope that she could outpace him, or she could try to confront the situation head-on and face the officer's aggression. But whatever decision she made, she knew she couldn't outrun the years of fears that had been instilled in her. The tension of being a black woman in a world that often saw her as a threat had followed her here, just as the officer's pursuit followed her through the park. As she pushed forward, her legs burning and her heart racing, Layla realized that she wasn't just running from one officer in a park. She was running from the weight of centuries of systemic racism that had been passed down through generations. But she was determined to not let that fear define her. She would keep running, not just for her safety, but for her right to exist without judgment, without suspicion. The seconds felt like hours as Layla pushed herself harder, her breath ragged and uneven. The trees behind her blurred as she sped through the park, her feet pounding against the path, her heart racing in her chest. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how hard she fought to distance herself from the officer, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. The officer's footsteps grew louder again, crashing through the underbrush behind her. Each sound was like a reminder that she was still trapped in this chase. She could feel the weight of his pursuit, like a shadow following her every move. Her mind screamed at her to go faster, to outrun him, but her body was beginning to fail her. She glanced over her shoulder just in time to see the officer closing the gap between them. His face, twisted with anger, was now set with determination, his jaw clenched tight, eyes fixed solely on her. He wasn't just chasing her to ask a few questions anymore. This was something more personal, more dangerous. His pursuit wasn't motivated by curiosity, it was fueled by something much darker. "Stop right there," he yelled again, his voice now an angry command, laced with frustration. "I'm telling you, stop running." But Layla didn't stop. She couldn't. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to keep moving, to not give him the satisfaction of catching her. If she stopped now, what would happen? Would he arrest her? Would he accuse her of something she hadn't done? Or worse, would he escalate his actions beyond just a simple chase? In that moment, Layla understood that this wasn't just a police officer doing his job. This was something much more insidious. This officer wasn't just trying to stop a crime, he had already decided that she was guilty of something, and he was willing to go to extreme lengths to prove it. The tension in the air thickened, and Layla's body tensed in response. She could feel the officer's anger radiating behind her, growing stronger with every step. It was no longer just a matter of avoiding capture, it was about survival. About escaping a man whose mind had already been made up about who she was, based on nothing but the color of her skin. Suddenly, the officer lunged forward, closing the gap more rapidly. Layla's breath caught in her throat, panic rising in her chest as she saw him gaining on her. Her muscles burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself harder, her mind screaming for her to keep going. She wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain the pace. The fear of being caught, of being pinned down by this officer, filled her with terror. Then it happened. The officer reached out, his hand grabbing the back of her jacket. Layla gasped in shock, the sudden contact jolting her body as she tried to pull away. She felt his grip tighten, yanking her back as her feet slipped on the gravel path. The world seemed to tilt, and for a split second, Layla feared that he was going to slam her into the ground, force her into submission. She could hear his heavy breathing as he struggled to maintain control. "You're not getting away from me," the officer spat, his voice low and filled with venom. There was no mistaking the hatred in his words. He wasn't seeing her as a person anymore. He wasn't seeing the woman who had simply been out for a walk in the park, he was seeing a target. A black woman who, in his eyes, didn't belong here. Desperation surged within her. Layla's breath was shallow, her hands trembling with fear and exhaustion, but her mind remained clear. She couldn't let this man control her. She couldn't let him define her by the assumptions he had made. With every ounce of strength she could muster, she twisted her body, jerking her arm free from his grip. Her feet slid against the gravel as she stumbled, but she regained her balance just in time to make another dash for freedom. She could hear the officer swearing behind her, his steps quickening once more. The sound of his pursuit was relentless, but Layla refused to give in. Her legs burned with fatigue, and her lungs screamed for air, but she kept going. She pushed herself harder, running faster than she thought was possible. The officer's presence was like a dark cloud following her, his pursuit relentless. It wasn't just about getting away anymore, it was about proving that she wouldn't be broken, that she wouldn't let someone's prejudice dictate her fate. As she approached the edge of the park, Layla saw a street ahead, a place where she knew there would be more people, more chances for help if things escalated further. She didn't look back, didn't dare take a moment to see if the officer was still behind her. The only thing that mattered was getting to that street, getting away from the officer who had already decided her fate without knowing anything about her. Her pulse quickened as the distance between the park's edge and the street grew shorter, but so did the distance between her and the officer. She could feel his footsteps growing louder, feel the anger radiating off him like a palpable force. Then, just as she reached the edge of the park, she saw something that made her heart stop. The officer had closed in. He was only a few feet behind her now. Layla's mind raced. She had to make it, she had to. Just one more step. And then, the officer grabbed her again. But this time, it wasn't like before. This time, the world shifted in a way Layla had never anticipated. As the officer's hands gripped her, pulling her back, the air seemed to grow heavier, and the looming threat of what could happen next became all too real. She didn't know how much more she could take, but she knew this chase wasn't over yet. Layla's world felt like it was closing in around her as the officer's grip tightened on her arm. His fingers dug into her skin, sending a surge of pain through her body as she struggled to break free. She had managed to dodge his hold once, but this time, there was no escaping his grasp. His strength was too much, and as he jerked her back toward him, she could feel the weight of his authority bearing down on her. His breath was ragged, filled with anger, and Layla could hear the growl of frustration in his voice. "You think you're just going to get away?" His words were sharp, biting, and filled with venom. "You're not going anywhere." Fear gripped Layla's chest, threatening to paralyze her. She tried to wriggle free, her body desperate for movement, but the officer's grip only tightened, pulling her back. It felt like everything was working against her. Her legs, now heavy with exhaustion, felt as if they could barely move. Her mind was clouded with the terror of what might happen next. She had been running, trying to outrun him, but in this moment, it felt as if her very survival was being ripped from her hands. The officer spun her around, and for a brief second, Layla saw the rage in his eyes. His face was twisted with fury, his jaw clenched, and his fists were tense at his sides, ready to strike if need be. This wasn't about questions or checks anymore, it was about control. He had been humiliated by the chase, and now, in his mind, he needed to assert his dominance. She was just another person to put in her place. "Stop fighting," he barked, his voice rising with aggression. "You don't get to run from me. I'll show you who's in charge here." Layla could see the gleam of his baton now, his hand inching toward it, his fingers brushing the cold metal. Her body tensed. She had seen the videos, the countless incidents where simple interactions had escalated into violence, where innocent people had been hurt or worse. She had always tried to distance herself from those realities, telling herself they didn't apply to her. But now, here she was, facing a man who had decided she didn't deserve to walk freely, simply because of the color of her skin. Her breath caught in her throat as the officer advanced on her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You should have stopped when I told you. Now you're going to learn what happens when people like you make things difficult." His words hit her like a slap, and Layla felt the sting of them more than the physical pain he inflicted. She wasn't a person to him, she wasn't a daughter, a student, a human being. She was someone to control, someone to remind of their place. And that realization made her heart ache with a depth she hadn't known before. She was caught, not just in a chase, but in the web of institutionalized racism that had defined so many interactions like this one. The officer stepped closer, and Layla's legs shook beneath her, her body filled with dread. She wanted to scream, to shout, to fight back, but she knew the consequences of resisting might be far worse. Her father had taught her the importance of staying calm in situations like this, but all of his lessons seemed to be fading into the background, drowned out by the overwhelming fear that now clouded her every thought. "Get on your knees," the officer ordered coldly, a twisted smirk crossing his face. He had fully intended to break her spirit. He wasn't just trying to arrest her, he wanted to humiliate her, to make her feel small, to remind her that, in his eyes, she was inferior. The terror of that moment washed over Layla. Her legs shook as she took a shaky step back, trying to distance herself from the officer's proximity, but it was no use. The officer's anger was too great, and his sense of authority was far too inflated for her to escape. His presence seemed to grow larger, towering over her like a dark cloud, pushing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. "Do you know who I am?" Layla's voice faltered, but she forced herself to speak, to remind him that there was more to her than what he saw in front of him. "My father, he's Captain Marcus Johnson," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "He's not just any officer. He's the head of the precinct." The officer's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening as if he hadn't expected her to say those words. For a brief moment, there was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. But it was quickly replaced by something else, something darker, something filled with spite. The recognition of her father's name seemed to stoke the officer's rage even further. He wasn't scared of who her father was, he was angry at the thought that someone like Layla, someone he deemed undeserving, could have such a powerful figure in her corner. "So what?" the officer sneered, taking another step toward her. "That doesn't make you special. Doesn't make you above the law." With those words, any chance Layla had of being treated with dignity was extinguished. In the officer's mind, she was still just another black woman to control. Her father's position meant nothing to him. All that mattered was maintaining the superiority he thought he had. Layla felt a wave of helplessness crash over her, but there was something else buried deep beneath the fear, something that refused to be extinguished. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let this officer, this man who saw her as a threat without cause, win. Summoning every last ounce of strength she had, Layla pushed back against the officer, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You don't know me," she said, her words a mixture of defiance and determination. "You don't know my story. You don't know what it's like to walk in my shoes. The officer hesitated for a split second, but then his hands moved to his belt, and the tension in the air grew thick. He wasn't done with her yet. The situation had escalated. It was no longer just a confrontation, it was a confrontation marked by the deep divisions of race, power, and fear. Layla realized that she was no longer just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting to survive in a world where people like this officer could get away with treating her as less than human. Layla's heart thundered in her chest as the officer's hand moved to his belt, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his baton. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through her body. Her legs felt like lead, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was paralyzed, caught in a web of fears that had been spun for her the moment the officer decided she was a target. The officer's eyes were locked on hers, his expression twisted with rage. His breathing was heavy, a reflection of the anger that seemed to surge through him like a tidal wave. Layla could feel it radiating off him, the hatred, the judgment, all directed at her. She was just standing there, trying to hold her ground, but in his eyes, she was already guilty of nothing more than being black and in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer's hand gripped his baton tighter, his knuckles white. Layla's body trembled, every instinct telling her to fight, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of this moment. But what could she do? The officer had already decided she was a threat. He had already written her off as something less, something to be controlled and humiliated. The power he had over her was terrifying, and it was becoming clear that he would stop at nothing to make her feel that power. "Get on your knees," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't get to run. You don't get to be free. I'm in charge here." Each word was like a slap across her face, a blow to her very existence. The officer didn't care who she was, what she had done, or who her father was. To him, Layla was nothing more than a black woman who had the audacity to question his authority. She was a target to him, and all the subtle, systemic racism that had been ingrained in him was coming to the surface in full force. Layla's breath caught in her throat, her chest constricting with the weight of what was happening. She didn't want to kneel. She didn't want to bow down to this man, this symbol of the systems that had oppressed her for so long. She wasn't just fighting against one officer, she was fighting against every ounce of racial prejudice that had been embedded in society, that had been passed down through generations. The officer stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved toward her. His shadow loomed over her, and Layla felt the crushing weight of his presence. It was as though the whole world had narrowed to this single moment, and there was no escape. The park, which had once been a place of peace, was now a battleground, a place where Layla's very identity, her very worth, was being challenged by this officer's actions. Layla's legs wobbled beneath her, the fear in her chest spreading like wildfire. The officer's baton was inches from her now, and she could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Her hands were shaking, her palms slick with sweat. She had to make a choice, but what could she do? If she resisted, she knew the situation could escalate, and the last thing she wanted was to give this officer a reason to use force. But if she gave in, if she let him break her, she would lose everything, her dignity, her self-respect, her right to exist freely in the world. In that moment, Layla remembered the countless stories she had heard, the ones of black men and women who had been caught in situations like this and paid the price with their lives. She thought of the news headlines, the footage, the protests that had followed in the wake of police brutality. She had grown up with those stories, hearing them whispered in her community, knowing that it could happen to anyone. And now, here she was, in the middle of a situation where anything could go wrong. The officer's eyes never left hers. His grip on the baton tightened, and Layla's pulse spiked. She could see the anger, the power in his stance, the way he saw himself as above her. She knew this wasn't just about what was happening here, in this moment. It was about something far bigger, something that went beyond this officer, beyond this park. It was about a lifetime of prejudice, a system that had failed her, that had failed so many others like her. For a moment, Layla felt like the world was spinning around her, her thoughts a blur of fear and anger. She was just one person, just one girl trying to make her way through the world. And yet, in this moment, she felt like she was carrying the weight of centuries of injustice. But then, something inside her shifted. The fear that had gripped her so tightly didn't disappear, But it began to mix with something else, a spark of defiance, a refusal to let this officer control her, to make her believe she wasn't worthy of respect. She wasn't going to give in to his power, to his hatred. She wasn't going to let him break her. With trembling hands, she lifted her chin, looking straight into the officer's eyes. She knew it wasn't enough to just survive this moment. She had to fight, to stand up for herself, for every black person who had ever been silenced by people like this officer. And in that moment, as she locked eyes with the officer, Layla made a decision. She would not kneel. She would not let him define her. She would stand, no matter what came next. Layla's breath came in ragged bursts as her legs carried her through the park, her muscles screaming for relief, but she couldn't stop, not now. The officer was still close behind, his presence felt in every step she took, the sound of his footsteps growing louder as he drew nearer. The park, which had once felt like a safe haven, now seemed like a maze designed to trap her. Every path she took seemed to lead her back to the officer, and she could feel the weight of his pursuit pressing down on her like a storm, relentless and unforgiving. She pushed herself harder, her body protesting, but she couldn't let up. Each moment felt like an eternity as she ran, her chest tight with fear, her mind spinning with uncertainty. What would happen if she stopped? What would happen if he caught her? The worst-case scenarios flooded her thoughts, being thrown to the ground, being arrested for a crime she hadn't committed, or worse, facing violence at the hands of someone who had already decided she was guilty. The officer was faster than she had anticipated. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, his figure was closer, his anger radiating off him like a weapon. His commands, shouted between labored breaths, only spurred her to go faster. "Stop! You're not going anywhere," he barked, his voice hoarse and filled with a mix of anger and frustration. Layla's mind raced, but her body pushed on instinctively. She had to keep moving, she had to get away. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Stay calm. Stay smart. Don't let them see you break." But the words felt hollow now, lost in the face of the officer's relentless pursuit. The fear she had grown up with, the subtle and not-so-subtle warnings her father had given her about how the world might treat her, how she might be judged because of her race, was now real, tangible. She wasn't just being chased, she was being hunted. She didn't know how much longer she could run. Her breath was shallow, her legs aching, but still, she kept going. The park seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the trees and pathways blurring in her vision as she pushed through the pain. It was as if the world had turned into a blur of movement and terror. Then, she heard the officer's voice again, closer now, closer than ever before. "I'm not done with you yet." Layla's heart lurched in her chest as she realized the officer wasn't just chasing her out of duty, he was chasing her to prove something. He wasn't interested in the truth, in finding out who she really was. He didn't care about the law or justice. This was about power. This was about asserting control over someone he saw as lesser, as a threat simply because of the color of her skin. In the back of her mind, Layla could hear her father's voice again, this time softer, more reassuring. "You belong here. You belong anywhere you choose to be." But in the harsh reality of the moment, it felt like the world was telling her otherwise. The officer's pursuit wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It was the embodiment of the systemic racism that had haunted her family for generations, the constant reminder that no matter how far she went, no matter how much she achieved, there would always be people who saw her as inferior, as someone to be controlled. The sound of the officer's heavy breathing grew louder behind her. He was gaining on her, his pursuit becoming more desperate with each passing second. The chase had turned into something more than just a physical race, it was a battle for control, for power. And Layla realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that the officer wasn't going to stop until he had taken that power back from her. In a last-ditch effort, Layla veered off the main path, darting into a narrow trail that led toward the park's wooded area. The trees were thick here, and the ground was uneven. She hoped the officer would have trouble keeping up with her in the dense undergrowth. Her breath was ragged as she sprinted, weaving through the trees and dodging branches that scraped against her skin. She could hear the officer behind her, but his movements were slower now, his pursuit hindered by the uneven terrain. But it wasn't enough. She stumbled. Her foot caught on a hidden root, and for a split second, Layla's body lurched forward. The world seemed to tilt as she fell to the ground, her knees slamming against the hard earth. Pain shot through her body, but she barely had time to register it. She pushed herself up immediately, but before she could regain her footing, the officer was upon her. He reached out and grabbed her arm, yanking her back with such force that Layla cried out in pain. She struggled, pulling against him, but his grip was unyielding. The officer's breath was hot on her neck as he forced her to the ground, pinning her down with a weight that felt suffocating. "Gotcha now," the officer muttered, his voice thick with anger and satisfaction. "I told you to stop." Layla's heart raced as she struggled beneath him, her body refusing to give in. Panic surged through her, but somewhere in the chaos, a part of her realized that she had no choice but to fight. She could feel the officer's knee pressing into her back, the weight of his body pinning her down, but she refused to let him break her. Not this time. The world seemed to blur as she fought, the fear building in her chest until it consumed everything. But Layla wasn't going to let this officer, this representation of the system that had always treated her as less, win. She was fighting not just for her own freedom, but for the right to exist in a world that too often saw people like her as nothing more than a threat. The officer's grip tightened, and for a moment, Layla thought she might lose this fight. But then, something inside her snapped, something deep, something primal, something that told her she had to survive, no matter the cost. Her legs kicked, her arms flailed, and in a burst of adrenaline, Layla managed to free herself from the officer's grasp. She scrambled to her feet, desperate to run again. But this time, the officer didn't follow. The chase, for now, had ended. But Layla knew this was far from over. Layla's heart was still pounding in her chest as she stumbled to her feet, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. She had managed to break free from the officer's grip, but the relief was fleeting. Her legs were unsteady, her body aching, but she couldn't stop, not yet. She couldn't afford to stop. Behind her, the officer was catching his breath, his voice filled with frustration and anger as he called out to her, his words harsh and venomous. "Where do you think you're going, huh?" he shouted. "You think you're just gonna run away like this?" Layla's heart raced as she kept moving, her legs carrying her farther away from the officer, her mind focused on one thing, survival. The pain in her knees and legs faded into the background as the fears that had been building inside her intensified. She had gotten away for now, but she knew this wasn't over. The officer wouldn't stop until he had some kind of control over her, until he had made her submit. "You're nothing but a problem," the officer's voice rang out, his words laced with venom. "Just like all the others." Layla's breath caught in her throat, a cold chill spreading through her as she realized the true nature of his words. He wasn't just mad about the chase, or about her running away. No, this was something deeper, something more insidious. The officer's frustration, his anger, wasn't just about his authority being challenged. It was about something far darker, his ingrained belief that people like her, people who looked like her, didn't belong. "You think you're special, don't you?" the officer spat, his tone mocking and filled with contempt. "Just because you're somebody's daughter? Just because you think you can get away with anything?" Layla's throat tightened as the words landed. He was speaking to her like she wasn't even human, like she was just an obstacle, a nuisance, something to be crushed underfoot. The officer was no longer simply accusing her of fleeing, he was projecting all his racial hatred onto her. He wasn't interested in who she was or what she stood for. To him, Layla was just another black woman to be controlled, to be silenced. She could feel the sting of his words deep in her chest. "You think you're special." The idea that just because she was black, she was automatically unworthy of respect, of being treated with dignity, was something she had encountered time and time again. But now, in this moment, with the officer's harsh words cutting through the air, she felt it more acutely than ever before. The officer wasn't just targeting her for fleeing. He was targeting her existence. He was angry that she, someone he saw as lesser, could be free, could move through the world as if she were equal. In his eyes, Layla wasn't just running from him, she was running from the very place he thought she should be in, beneath him, beneath his authority, beneath his control. "You think you can just run away from me? From the law? From the system?" The officer's voice had grown louder, more agitated. "You think you can just act like you're better than everyone else?" Layla's chest tightened as she kept moving, the weight of his words pressing down on her with every step. She had been subjected to this kind of treatment before, the subtle, the overt racism, the assumption that she didn't belong, that she wasn't worthy of being seen as an equal. But hearing it from this officer, in the heat of the moment, in the midst of this chase, made the weight of it all feel crushing. "You're no better than the rest of them," the officer sneered, his words dripping with disdain. "You think you're some kind of exception just because you're his daughter? But you're just like the others. All of you." The officer's words stung like a slap to the face. Layla could feel the rage building inside her, the desire to fight back, to scream at him that she was more than just a target, more than just a black woman in a world that tried to make her feel small. But she didn't dare stop. She couldn't. She was too afraid of what might happen if she did. She could hear the officer's footsteps behind her, his words continuing to burn her ears, but she kept moving, focused on the one thing she could control, her ability to run. She didn't look back. She couldn't. His words were like weapons, and she didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply they had cut. "You're nothing," the officer spat as Layla pushed herself forward, her legs aching, but her determination growing stronger with each step. "Just another black problem in this city. You think you're better? You're not." The final words, "you're not," echoed in her mind as she pushed forward. They were meant to break her, to remind her of the place the officer thought she should occupy in society. But Layla refused. She refused to accept the narrative he was trying to write for her. She was not just a problem. She was a person. She was her own story. The officer's words would stay with her, gnawing at her, but Layla refused to let them define her. She had been running from him, from his prejudice, but she was also running toward something, her freedom, her dignity, her right to exist as an equal in a world that sometimes didn't want to accept her. She was not his to control. She was not anyone's to control. The chase had reached a fever pitch. Layla's legs were on fire, her breath ragged, and every step felt like it might be her last. But she couldn't stop now. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding with each other as fear and adrenaline battled for dominance. The officer's voice echoed behind her, filled with anger and frustration, urging her to stop, threatening consequences she couldn't afford to face. Her pulse quickened, and despite the exhaustion that weighed down her limbs, she pushed herself forward. She wasn't just running for herself anymore, she was running for every person who had ever been judged because of their skin color, every person who had ever been forced to prove they belonged. She was running for her father, for her family, for everything she had ever fought for. But just as she thought she might finally lose him, just as the sound of the officer's footsteps grew dangerously close, something in the air shifted. The officer's voice, filled with rage, faltered slightly. There was a momentary hesitation in his steps, a brief break in the pursuit. "Stop," he shouted again, his voice now strained. "I'll make you regret this." Layla's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if it was her exhaustion or the overwhelming tension in the air, but she suddenly felt an unfamiliar sense of urgency. She glanced over her shoulder, her body still running on instinct, but she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Through the trees, just ahead, she saw a figure. The officer didn't see it, but Layla did. Her breath caught as the realization hit her like a wave. It was her father, Captain Marcus Johnson. In that split second, everything slowed down. The world around Layla seemed to quiet as the officer's words began to lose their weight. She was still trapped in the chase, still filled with fear and uncertainty, but the presence of her father, the man she had always known to be a pillar of strength, of authority, was like a beacon in the darkness. The officer, still chasing her, had no idea who he was about to face. "Layla," her father called out, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His tone wasn't one of alarm, but of authority, a command that demanded respect. The officer froze. Layla's legs stopped moving before she even realized it. Her chest heaved as she looked toward her father, her body still tense with fear, but now filled with a strange combination of relief and defiance. The chase, the race to outrun the officer's hostility, had reached a turning point. The officer's eyes widened as he finally noticed the man standing in front of him, walking steadily toward them with unwavering confidence. Captain Marcus Johnson, her father, the man who had served as an upstanding officer of the law for years, was not just any officer. He was a figure of power, of respect. He had led the department for years, and he commanded a presence that no one could ignore, not even the officer chasing his daughter through the park. The officer's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of Captain Johnson, and for the first time since the chase began, his confidence wavered. His expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to fear. He had assumed he was chasing just another black woman, someone to be subjugated, someone beneath him. But this wasn't just anyone. This was the daughter of the most influential officer in the precinct. The officer's hand instinctively moved away from his baton as he stepped back, realizing too late who Layla was. Her father, the man he had openly belittled by assuming his daughter was just another problem, now stood in front of him. The recognition was slow but undeniable. The officer was suddenly aware that the woman he had been chasing wasn't just another woman on the street, she was the daughter of the very man who could undo him with a single phone call. "Captain Johnson," the officer stammered, his voice faltering as he took a step back, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. Layla stood still, her breath still quick, her chest still tight, but there was something different now. The terror that had overtaken her just moments ago began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of power. Her father had arrived, and with him came the undeniable force of justice. The officer's power, his authority, suddenly seemed small, insignificant. Captain Johnson's eyes didn't leave the officer's face, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable command. "Why are you chasing my daughter?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't answer, not without revealing the truth. He had assumed Layla was guilty without cause. He had seen her running and decided to make her a target simply because of the color of her skin. Now, faced with the reality of who she was, his actions seemed not only unjust, but deeply foolish. "Answer me," Captain Johnson pressed, his voice low and authoritative, but still controlled. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Layla and Captain Johnson. I thought she was a suspect," he stammered, his voice weak and filled with excuses. "She was running, and I—" "Running?" Captain Johnson interrupted, his voice sharp. "That's it? You decided to chase down my daughter simply because she was running in a park? You think that gives you the right to treat her this way?" The officer's face reddened as he struggled to find a response. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The weight of the situation was dawning on him. He had acted out of prejudice, out of a belief that people like Layla didn't belong in spaces like this, spaces that were often reserved for those who had power, for those who looked like him. Captain Johnson took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You will explain yourself to internal affairs. Your actions today will not go unnoticed." The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of his mistake, nodded nervously. He couldn't speak, his previous bravado entirely gone, replaced by the crushing weight of realization. He had crossed a line, one that would cost him more than just his position. Layla stood in silence, watching as her father took control of the situation, her heart still racing but filled with a quiet sense of relief. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about something far bigger, something that transcended this one officer and this one moment. Her father had just reminded the officer, and the world, that power wasn't just about authority. It was about justice, respect, and knowing when to stand up for what was right. Layla looked at her father, his calm demeanor now the anchor in the storm that had almost overwhelmed her. And for the first time since the chase began, she felt like she could finally breathe again. The park felt eerily still as Captain Marcus Johnson stepped forward, his presence commanding the space. The officer stood frozen, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and humiliation. Layla watched her father, a sense of awe mixing with the relief flooding through her veins. He was calm, collected, his authority unshaken. But inside, Layla's mind was racing. She had never thought that this moment, this confrontation, would unfold the way it did. Her father's gaze never left the officer. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying power to his words that made the officer shrink back. "You were chasing my daughter through this park, treating her like a criminal. You didn't stop to ask why she was running. You didn't stop to consider that she might just be a person out for a walk, just like anyone else." The officer opened his mouth, as though trying to defend himself, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. There was no defense for what he had done, no justification that could stand up to the reality of the situation. He had chased Layla, not because she had committed a crime, but because of the color of her skin. I thought she was acting suspicious, the officer stammered, his voice faltering as his previous bravado evaporated. She was running, and I didn't know who she was. Captain Johnson didn't flinch. You didn't care who she was, he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. You didn't care to find out anything about her, did you? All you saw was a black woman running through a park, and you assumed the worst. The officer's face twisted with discomfort, his eyes darting between Captain Johnson and Layla. His earlier hostility had vanished, replaced with nervousness and fear. The weight of his actions, the truth of what he had done, was now undeniable. Layla felt a tightness in her chest as her father spoke, but there was something else too, a rising sense of power, of justice. This officer had chased her, humiliated her, treated her like she was a threat for no reason other than the color of her skin. He had let his prejudice decide her fate without even knowing who she was. And now, facing the reality of who Layla's father was, the officer was crumbling under the weight of his own ignorance. But the most shocking part of all came next. Captain Johnson took a deep breath, his gaze steady, his voice still calm, but now filled with an undeniable finality. What you don't understand, officer, is that you just tried to arrest my daughter, someone who is more than just a face in a crowd. You didn't know that she was the daughter of the man who runs this department, someone who could have shut down your career with a single phone call. You didn't know that, did you? The officer's face went pale as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His hands trembled slightly as he took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The truth was staring him in the face now, the truth that he had been so blind to, so consumed by his own assumptions. He had acted out of his own bias, out of his own sense of superiority, without ever questioning why Layla was there in the first place. The officer stammered, his voice shaking as he tried to speak. I didn't know. I didn't mean. Captain Johnson held up his hand, cutting him off. That's the problem, officer. You never bothered to find out. You assumed. You saw my daughter running and thought that gave you the right to chase her down, humiliate her, threaten her. And now, you'll face the consequences of your actions. Layla could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wanted to scream, to let out the anger that had been building inside her, but she didn't. She just stood there, silent, watching as the officer's facade crumbled. His previous bravado, his belief that he was in control of the situation, had evaporated in the face of the truth. The truth that Layla was more than just a target of his prejudice, she was a person, someone with power, someone whose voice mattered. The officer's face had drained of color, and Layla could see the realization sinking in. His posture was no longer one of confidence, it was one of defeat. He had been exposed for what he truly was, a man who had used his authority not to protect, but to persecute. He had let his racism guide his actions, and now he was paying the price. Captain Johnson's voice was steady as he spoke again, his eyes never leaving the officers. You will be reported for your actions today. Your treatment of my daughter, your failure to act in accordance with the law, will not go unnoticed. You will answer for this. Layla could feel the air shift, a strange sense of justice filling her chest. The officer had crossed a line, and her father was there to make sure he faced the consequences. For the first time since the officer had begun chasing her, Layla felt a sense of relief, of something close to victory. This was not just about her, this was about making sure this never happened to anyone else again. The officer stood frozen, a look of shame and fear on his face. He knew the consequences of his actions were beyond his control now. There would be no escaping what he had done. Captain Johnson turned to Layla, his eyes softening for a moment as he spoke. Are you okay? He asked, his voice low, filled with concern. Layla nodded, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer now than it had been in the heat of the chase. She was safe. And the officer, the man who had tried to break her, would now face the consequences of his prejudice. I'm fine, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. But I'm not the only one who needs to be heard. The air felt still, almost suffocating, as the officer stood before Captain Marcus Johnson, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Layla stood beside her father, her heart still racing from the chase, but now tempered by something different, a growing sense of power. She had feared for her life only moments ago, but now, with her father standing strong, the weight of injustice seemed to shift. The officer's once confident posture had crumbled, his facade of authority shattered. The park, which had been a place of tension and fear, now felt like a battleground. The power dynamics had shifted, and what had started as a terrifying chase had transformed into a moment of reckoning. Captain Johnson's unwavering presence was like a shield, a reminder that justice, though often slow, could prevail when someone stood up against wrongdoings. Layla watched her father with admiration. This wasn't just a father protecting his daughter, it was a man standing up to the system, demanding accountability for the racial prejudice and abuse of power that had defined the officer's actions. In that moment, her father was more than just a figurehead in law enforcement, he was a symbol of what it meant to fight for what was right, no matter the personal cost. "Do you realize what you've done?" Captain Johnson's voice was calm, but filled with an undeniable authority. His words carried the weight of years of service, of respect earned through hard work and integrity. But now, there was no room for leniency. The officer had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The officer's face had gone pale, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He had seen himself as the law, someone above reproach, but now he was nothing more than a man who had let his prejudice dictate his actions. He had chased Layla, humiliated her, and used his authority as a weapon against her, all because of her race. And now, the truth was out. He was exposed. I didn't mean to," the officer stammered, his words faltering, but there was no apology in his voice. It wasn't remorse that had gripped him, it was fear. Fear of the consequences that were now inevitable. Captain Johnson didn't let the officer off the hook. "You didn't mean to," he repeated, his voice low and steady. "You didn't mean to harass and intimidate my daughter? You didn't mean to escalate a situation because you thought she didn't belong here?" He shook his head slowly, disappointment lining his features. "I don't care what you meant. What matters is what you did. And you're going to answer for that." Layla's chest tightened as she watched the scene unfold. The officer's excuses didn't matter. What mattered was that he had tried to break her, to make her feel like she was less than human simply because of the color of her skin. She wasn't just running from a police officer anymore, she was running from a system that had conditioned people like him to view her as a threat, to see her as inferior. But her father, standing there, had just dismantled that system, at least, for this moment. The officer's eyes darted around, but there was no escape from the reality of his actions. "I'll be reporting this," Captain Johnson said, his voice final. "I'll be making sure this is documented, that everyone knows what you did, and that you're held accountable." The officer opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, and all he could do was stand there in silence, watching as his world crumbled around him. Captain Johnson turned to Layla, his expression softening for the first time since the confrontation had begun. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Layla looked up at him, the fear she had felt earlier now replaced with something else, something stronger. She nodded slowly, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions inside her. "I'm fine," she said, her eyes never leaving the officer who was still standing before them, his head bowed in shame. "But I'm not the only one who needs to be heard." Captain Johnson gave her a nod of understanding. "You're right. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been treated this way. Everyone who's been silenced. Today, it stops here." As the officer was taken into custody, Layla felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. She had won this battle, yes, but the war wasn't over. There were others like him, others who harbored the same prejudice, the same hatred. But today, in this moment, Layla had made a stand. Her father had made a stand. And that meant everything. The sound of sirens in the distance seemed to echo through the park, a reminder that justice was still being served. But it was clear now, justice wasn't just about the law. It was about standing up for what was right, about demanding accountability, and about making sure that people like the officer who had chased her would never again have the power to treat others as less than human. As Layla walked away from the scene with her father, she knew that things wouldn't be the same. The fear and the shame that had consumed her were slowly fading, replaced by something stronger, hope. She had seen firsthand that the system could be challenged, that it could be held accountable, and that in the face of injustice, there was always room for justice. She wasn't just running anymore. She was walking tall. And she wasn't alone.